Well, in 2 months, Tom Mulcair finds out just what his party really thinks of him. Do they want to review his leadership? He's already signaled he's ready for a fight, accepting blame for the party's election defeat and saying he's ready to build on the lessons learned. But he has to win their support first. That can be a party leader's nightmare. In a moment, the insiders, Jamie, Kathleen, and David, tell us why and how best to navigate difficult waters. But first, some background. Let's face it, if as a party leader you want to play political hardball, you'd look at any vote reviewing your leadership this way. When I pass 50% of the ballots cast, stop counting and burn the ballots. A majority is a majority, and I have one. But life and Canadian politics is just not that simple. Ask Joe Clark. He walked into this Tory convention in 1983, having allowed the media and his critics to set 70% as the vote result he would need to keep his leadership.
I will be recommending to the National Executive that they call a convention at the earliest.
Well, he got 67%. Waited only a few minutes and called for a leadership convention. 6 months later, Brian Mulroney had his job. Next up for the test, John Turner. After taking his Liberals from a majority position down to 40 seats in the mid-'80s, the Boo Birds were calling. They argued Clark had set the bottom line for all parties with his 67%, and they were convinced they could bring Turner down to that number. But they didn't.
Now I know that I have your confidence.
Turner survived with 76%, but was gone 5 years later. The NDP have always been far kinder to their leaders. No nasty internal fights here, at least not in front of the cameras. Instead, review votes often in the 90s. But the NDP has never had a year like this past one, plummeting from first in the polls to third in a matter of weeks. So what has history taught us? How have the rules changed? How do the parties' processes differ? And what really goes on behind the scenes during these votes? Time for some answers. And let's try and get some, starting with Jamie, who's in London tonight. London, England, that is. Jamie, 70%, 67, 70%, is that still kind of the figure that's used going back to the Clark days? Is that what most parties think? You've got to pass that number?
Well, I think you've got to at least pass that number, Peter, and you may have to pass a higher number than that. The problem with these things, it's the only election that doesn't have a definitive point of victory. 50% plus one, or like when you're amending the party constitution, sometimes a 2/3 majority. This is one that people sort of make up out of the air. And as you said in your setup piece, it's the combination of the media, your opponents, whatever. It's a spin game, and it's all about matching expectations. So I would say that Clark number is the floor, but I would imagine for someone like Mr. Mulcair, it's going to have to be a bit higher than that in order for him to be successful.
Kathleen, where are you on this?
Well, it's interesting. Certainly, I think the 70 number has become convention, if you will. But think back to that time period. The media was far less wasn't as fragmented as it is today. The political landscape really wasn't as fragmented as today. So it's interesting. I think what Mr. Mulcair really has to look for is building support going forward, and less than focusing on a number. I think what he and those people who are working on his campaign around him are going to be looking for is how we can move and gel the party and the members, not just on April 8th, 9th, and 10th when the convention's happening in Edmonton, but in the months and years to come.
David, you were working for Turner back in '86 when he got that 76% number. Was the assumption then that you just had to get into the 70s and you'd be okay?
Well, first of all, 76.3, Peter. Let's be precise about this. I think everybody felt back then that you have to beat the Clark number. But I think the true answer to the question is exactly what both Jamie and Kathleen said, which is it's more of a qualitative assessment that a leader has to make about whether or not they have a party that can actually be unified coming out of a leadership review process that will allow them to have a real shot at forming government and running a strong campaign in the next election. And you know, that's a softer assessment to make. It could be that in some parties 60% would be good enough to do that. It actually turned out that in Mr. Turner's case, even 76% wasn't enough to really do that. And so you understand a little bit more in historical context why why people like Clark and, frankly, John Tory at the provincial level made the decisions that they made, which is to say, I could carry on with this, but is it really in my interest or the party's interest for me to carry on with this?
When we look at this process unfolding for the NDP right now, is it, aside from the numbers game, is it really the same process now in each party that leads to that final counting, or are there differences here? Kathleen?
Well, let's explain what the process is for the NDP. For instance, when they go into convention, what the members will be voting on is actually, the question will be phrased this way. It's, should the party commence a contest to elect a new leader? So we're actually looking for a negative vote here. What you want is a bunch of no's in the room. And so that's how our party does it. And, in the past, Mr. Mulcair himself, his last and only leadership review that he's had from the party, he received around 92%, and that was just shortly a year after his election as party leader. So he's going to have to get that number, and he's going to be looking for lots of no's in the room.
And they do have to be in the room, right? As opposed to the convention he won the leadership at, where people were voting from across the country.
That's right. There's all sorts of rules around these conventions. What happens is you have to be in the room. You can't vote electronically. Also, how delegates are allotted, how you actually get to go to Edmonton and place your vote. First, you have to be a member, and the delegates are actually allotted as per the ridings, a number of members per riding. Each riding gets at least 2, a youth delegate and a regular delegate.
But Peter, let's take the NDP out of it and just look at what all of these things have in common. And one of them is that your opponent doesn't have to declare themselves. So while you're running for your job, you're running for your life, you're actually boxing with shadows, or you can be boxing with shadows. Members of your own party, leadership races are divisive. Reviews are really divisive because people can be up to all kinds of shenanigans and not have to come out and declare themselves, so you don't even know what you're fighting about. Often that's one of the things, and David knows more about this, which makes tracking what the outcome is going to be quite unreliable, because people will openly say that they're supporting the leader and then go knife them in the back in the ballot box.
No, well, explain to me, David, not just the tracking, but perhaps how do you compete when you're boxing against shadows? Now, I guess you have a pretty good idea where the major opposition is coming from, even if they're not declared and visible. But how do you compete against that?
Well, I think, to Jamie's point, if there isn't an obvious alternative, the leader is probably safe. And this is one of Mr. Mulcair's strongest attributes going into this leadership review, I think, is that there isn't an obvious candidate to replace him. Mr. Clark faced Mr. Mulrooney sitting out there as an obvious person who could step in and do it. Mr. Turner faced Mr. Chrétien sitting out there as an obvious person who could step in and have a constituency in the party. If you don't have that, it's probably unlikely that enough people are going to coalesce around review in order to make your life difficult. But as Jamie says, they hide in the shadows. They don't say, Mulrooney didn't say, I'll be leader if Clark steps down, and Clark should step down, nor did Chrétien say that about Turner. One of the keys to winning these things is to draw them out and actually make it a choice. Draw those people out from the shadows and into the light and say, this is not really about whether or not you should have confidence in the existing leader. It's about this other person's ambitions, and make that kind of a framing on the thing.
Kathleen?
Well, and that's something that Premier Selinger just recently did, actually. He was about to face a leadership review and instead called himself a leadership contest, and then won that contest, if you recall, just recently, and is now about to enter into an election campaign in Manitoba. But Manitoba is interesting. I mean, let's look at the history of NDP leaders, not just federally, but also provincially. Gary Dewar, for instance, was NDP leader for 10 years, lost 3 times as leader, and certainly the knives were out for him. But then he went on and he won 3 elections in a row, and had a great record in that province of governing. So, there's lots to learn from history, from all the parties, but even from New Democratic history, both provincially and federally, of how the next few weeks can shape up.
I think that's a pretty key point, because one of the things that is always a big factor in this, they happen after defeats. Let's start with that. There's never a leadership review after a victory, or at least depending on your view of 2003, 2002, 2003. But generally these things happen after defeats. And the question is, how much of the blame does the party place on the leader for the defeat? So in the Conservatives' case in 1981 and 1983, there was a big segment of the party that really blamed Joe Clark for having lost the government. In the Liberal Party in 1986, there was more of a sense that Turner, although he hadn't run a very effective campaign, really fell victim to the cumulative weight of 16 years of Liberal government, and that he deserved his own chance at an election. That's one of the things that, one of the cases Mr. Mulcair is going to have to put forward. How much blame does he personally bear for the defeat?
All right, Jamie, let me ask you a question, mainly because of where you are tonight, sitting in London. The process is a little different there, because we witnessed in the early 90s with Margaret Thatcher, who was prime minister at the time. Her party, the caucus, dumped her from that position, and she had to give up 10 Downing Street. How much weight does the caucus carry in Canada in terms of this process of leadership review? Obviously, it carried a lot of weight in Britain, but here in Canada, how much weight does it carry?
Peter, and of course, not just in Britain, in Australia, for example, as well, where, you know, Prime Minister one day and a bum the next. It depends. It's like in anything. MPs are important. The ones that decide to get active and to be organizers. I think back, for example, to the leadership review question, would there be one, for which Alison Redford faced, and, you know, MPs like Mamie Bhullar were very, very pivotal in delivering her, you know, a decisive win. So sometimes they can make a big difference in terms of their persuasion. But the other thing that's fun about these things for people who follow politics is people who find the one member, one vote kind of boring now can actually see a real old-fashioned convention where the delegates make a difference.
Boy, you've got to be the first person to describe it as fun. This process.
It's not fun for the people involved. Jamie mentioned earlier how divisive these things are. I'd be very surprised if anybody who hasn't been through a leadership review fight and been involved in that fight doesn't have more animosity towards some people in their own party than they ever will toward members of another party.
And that will be the test for New Democrats, whether we can go through this process, right, and not actually tear each other apart.
And is there any evidence that that's what's going on now, Kathleen? I know, you know, it's early, I guess, in some ways in the process, so there are full 2 months to go here. But, you know, we've all talked about this issue of a visible opposition. There does not appear to be one, and as David points out, there doesn't seem to be a visible replacement, or at least not one that's on the tip of everybody's tongue.
Yeah, there's not a visible opposition, and there's not subterranean organizing that's even going on. And I've made a lot of calls over the last several weeks, so I'm not hearing that happening. I think that you have to remember that this was Mr. Mulcair's first campaign, and I think that it was important that he took the actions that he did in the last week in terms of taking some responsibility for the campaign. But New Democrats are still coming to terms, I think, with what happened in October. It was the closest that this party had ever come to forming government, and so the fall has been that much harder for many of us, and so we're still grappling with that and how the party moves forward. I think that there's still many discussions and kind of debriefs to happen in the weeks to come, but I certainly don't see any kind of organizing happening to replace the leader as of yet.
All right, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, this question: what's your favorite review story? And welcome back to The Insiders. Jamie, Kathleen, and David are all with us. Let's get to that part we always like to tell on The Insiders, and that's your favorite sort of story from the inside on a leadership campaign of the past where the review process was in full flight. Jamie, why don't you tell us yours first?
Well, hands down, it comes from John Tory after he lost that election in Ontario around funding for private schools. He was in a really tough place, and the party was unhappy. And he gave us the speech of his life at his leadership review. He stepped way out of his comfort zone. He threw away his podium. He started in a darkened room. And he actually moved the numbers very substantially by his own personal performance, his authentic performance that night. And he didn't hit it out of the park in terms of the numbers, but he did a really good job. And that always is the one I remember.
Okay. Kathleen, what about you?
If I can fit in two quickly, I think that the story of Andrea Horwath in 2014 was a good one. Many regarded that campaign in Ontario to be a failure of the NDP, although they achieved a good result in terms of their seat count. She went into a very contentious political environment where the media and many members had written her off, yet pulled off about 5 months later a leadership review that was higher than her previous one in a previous convention. And just quickly, I've got a note to Alexa McDonough. In 2001, she faced a leadership review in Winnipeg against a contender, Marcel Hash, who's actually being supported by some big Labour leaders like Buzz Hargrove at the time. And despite she'd had a disappointing election result, reduced down to 13 seats, but came out of that with an 85% vote to Marcel's only 15. So that was a big win for her that day too in Winnipeg.
All right, David, you've been in some pretty bitter campaigns in the past, both leadership campaigns and review process campaigns. Tell us your favorite.
Well, in terms of a review, I could probably sit here all night and tell stories, and many people would not enjoy them. But the one that I would relay here is that in the 1986 review with Mr. Turner, as Jamie said earlier, you can't really have reliable tracking. You don't really know whether you can trust people to vote as they say that they're going to vote. You never really know how they're going to turn out. And in '86, the party would not tell Mr. Turner before the vote was announced what the vote was. So he and his family and his supporters were sitting in the audience as the result was announced, not knowing any more than anybody else did what the result of that vote was, except that one of the co-chairs of the convention, Doug Frith, as he stood at the podium before they announced the results, looked directly at Mr. Turner and winked at him. And if you were to show video of that, you could see Mr. Turner, Jill Turner, and their whole family and a lot of the rest of us visibly relax at that point, knowing that we had crossed whatever threshold we needed to.
You know, I had forgotten that fact, that they don't tell, or at least they didn't on that occasion. I seem to think that other leaders have been told, especially if it's one where they got to make a pretty quick decision. But that must be extremely painful, sitting there waiting for that number if you have no idea what it's going to be. Listen, thanks for all the insight and the war stories from the past. Jamie in London, Kathleen in snowbound Ottawa tonight. A lot of snow there, and David here in Toronto.